have with us today Ashish Kothari. Welcome, Ashish. Thank you to be with us. The seminar today is about pathway and texture for post-development, a tapestry of alternative. Ashish is, for a long time, we invite him in this international master program. Ashish is the founder and member of the India Environmental Group Kaparwish. He coordinated the Indian National Biodiversity Strategy and the action plan process. Ashish has been active in many citizen movements, Save Narmada, Save the Seeds. Actually, he supported the coordination of Vikalp Sangam, Alternative Confluence process in India, and the global tapestry of initiative at the international level. He is also the animator of Pedagogue, Post-Development Academy Activist Global Group. He published many books on the issue of post-development, people and environment, biodiversity, and radical ecological democracy. In 1996, he published People and the Protected Areas in India toward participatory conservation. He opened at that time the issue of participatory conservation and the different way of the relationship between people and the environment. In 1997, Understanding Biodiversity, Life, Equity, and Sustainability, the relation between biodiversity and right, sustainability, equity. In 1998, Community Conservation, Natural Resource Management in South and Central Asia. In 2001, People, Parks, and Wildlife toward coexistence. In 2004, Indigenous and Local Community and the Protected Areas toward equity and enhanced the conservation. Equity and conservation. Sometimes people thinking or conservationists think just in conservation without thinking in equity. In 2012, Churning the Earth, the Making Global India. In 2015, Protected Areas Governance and Management. In 2017, Alternative Futures, India Unlashed. In 2019, he published the Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary with Ayel Saleh, Arturo Escobar, Federico De Maria, and Alberto Acosta. I think the contribution of Ashish is very important. Either in the movement, in the action, in the field, either in the reflection. For us, it's very important to have him here to think about a new world, to change the world. Concepts like rainbow, alternative, radical ecological democracy, confluence, tapestry, etc. So I let the floor to Ashish. I'm very proud to have him here again. Many thanks, Ashish, to be here.
Thank you, Massimo. Thanks for that generous introduction, and happy to be with you all again, even though it's only on screen. Please let me know if there are times when my voice is breaking up, because I think there's some issues with my internet here. But hopefully it will go well. Okay, so I'll get straight into the presentation and speak for maybe about 35 40 minutes, and then we can open up for question, answer, and comments. So let me know if this is working. Or
okay, thank you, Ashish, very much.
Ashish, you was frozen for a few minutes. Maybe you can close the camera and advance with the presentation.
yeah, okay, yeah. Hopefully that should work. All right, so
Perfect.
I think we're all familiar with the kinds of global crises, local to global crises that we're in, multiple different kinds, from the very individual level of alienation and loneliness and all of that, to the global crises of biodiversity, climate, and much else. So I'm not going to go into any detail here, because most of us are familiar with these. We have also realized, especially in the global south, countries like India, that in the name of development, the kinds of processes and projects that are being imposed on many parts of the world, of course they provide some benefits, but they also come as enormous violence against nature, like you see in this advertisement, and also against people, especially communities who are most directly dependent on nature and natural resources. And I call livelihoods, which were occupations like farming and fisheries and forest and so on. They were not jobs, they were livelihoods connected to nature and to culture. To what we now have, which is either lots of unemployment, underemployment, or employment in mass production systems where there is no creativity. People basically are, they're what I call soul deadening jobs or deadlihoods. We also know that the same process of development and unlimited economic growth has brought the Earth to various stages of collapse. In fact, this map is already old. Just a couple of weeks back, another study was published showing that 8 out of 10 planetary boundaries have already been crossed or in the process of being crossed. From signs all across the world, like wildfires and extreme heat waves and floods and droughts, that climate collapse is already at our doorstep. We're already facing it. So there is a very fundamental question to be asked about economic growth as a strategy for development or for human well-being. We are also aware with increasing evidence that the world is becoming a more and more unequal place, with the rich getting richer and richer, a handful of billionaires owning half the world's population, and the rest remaining poor or actually sliding into further different kinds of poverty. Another very important aspect of this same model of development and economic growth is that it actually does not expand democratic spaces. It is reducing democratic spaces where people are protesting, where people are saying, we don't want to give our land for mining, we don't want to be displaced, and so on. Then those people who are resisting are killed or imprisoned or labeled as being anti-national, anti-development, terrorist, and so on. So just now, for instance, a couple of weeks back in India, we had the G20 summit. India is the current president of the G20, and a people summit for that was stopped by the police, even though it was a peaceful indoors event where people were saying that we have our own voice also to be heard. So actually, democratic spaces also shrink in this kind of process. Finally, what we're seeing in this is that the same system of corporations and governments that is creating the problem comes to us with what they call solutions, such as, for instance, moving from fossil fuel cars to electric vehicles. Now, that sounds good, but we know that if it's really about replacing each individual fossil car with an electric vehicle, it is not really a solution. It still needs a lot of mining, as you see in this picture, and it doesn't solve a whole bunch of other problems, including mobility for the poor. So what we need really is much more fundamental alternatives, and that's what's going to be my focus over the next half an hour or so. Firstly, we see that alternatives come in the form of resistance, where people, communities across the world are saying enough is enough. We will not accept this form of what you call development and growth. This particular picture is from about 35 years back, the late 1980s, when in central India, indigenous people in 300 villages protested against two very large hydroelectricity projects that were to come up on this river. And it was very interesting that they were not just arguing against their the drowning out of their lands and the dislocation of their villages because of the dams. They were also saying that while for the government, this river is a commodity, it is for hydroelectricity. For us, the river is our mother. Our mother to be bound by your dreams of progress in this way. So we will protect her. And it was a successful movement. But why I'm giving this example is because this, like many other movements around the world of resistance, are also showing to us not just what we don't want, but also other forms of relating to the rest of nature, relating to each other as human beings. This is seen in the anti-racism movements. This is seen in the movements for new constitutions, like in Chile. It's seen in the farmers movement, which became very famous a couple of years back in India. or the peace movements, or the youth climate justice movements, anti-coal movement. So if you look at across these, people are articulating alternative visions of how they want to live on the planet. But along with that, we also have another kind of alternative, which is constructive, constructing possibility of meeting the needs of people, the needs and aspirations of people. These could be basic needs like water and energy and housing and so on, or beyond that, education, health, having a voice in decision making, gender justice, and a lot more. This book, which I'll introduce right at the end, which Asim has already mentioned, has about 100 examples of these radical alternatives from around the world. Let me give you a glimpse. For me, this is personally for me the most inspiring one in India, where 5,000. Am I breaking up? Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Hi, Ashish, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
You can continue.
Okay, was I breaking up there? Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can continue. There is some problem with the connection, but go on.
Okay, no, I think it's my connection here, which is the problem. Hopefully it should work all right now. Okay, so yeah, if at some point I'm freezing, just please indicate this to me. Okay, so this is the first example I'm giving, and as I was saying, this is the most inspiring for me here in India, because it comes from what was the most oppressed or marginalized, exploited section of society, which is Dalit women. Dalits are the so-called outcasts or untouchables of Hindu society, about 200 million of them. And as women also, they're marginalized in a patriarchal society. So till about 30 years back, they were facing situation of hunger and malnutrition and no access to education, health facilities, and so on. Then they gathered themselves into women's committees across about 75 villages, and they brought back their traditional forms of agriculture, which are very diverse, with a lot of different diversity of seeds. We call millets in India, which are the traditional grains, but also varieties of rice and wheat and pulses and so on. They switched back completely to organic production, and also collectivizing a lot of their activities, making grain banks in every village, and many, many other things. And through that, they were actually able to create complete food security for 5,000 families, and also what they call food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with food production, the land, the water, the seeds, the knowledge. Then they went beyond that, and also started making their own movies and films. They run a community radio station. And through all of this, they've actually radically transformed their lives, which, as I said earlier, was marginalized and exploited. Today, they are proud and dignified residents of the villages that they live in. A similar example in a very different context. This is the Parque de la Papa in the potato park in Peru, in the Andes, the highlands of the Andes. And here the Quechua indigenous peoples have taken control over a very large biocultural territory, which is one of the origins of the potato, by the way. And here they continue growing a large diversity of crops, and also assert their own decision making across that whole landscape. A third example, a little further north from there, this is in the Amazon, in the Ecuador part of the Amazon, where the Sapara indigenous nation have also asserted their self-determination over their entire traditional territory, resisting oil mining and so on, but also trying to continue their traditional forms of relationship with the forest and the river, their own knowledge systems, but also relate to the outside world through things like medical community-based ecotourism. And Massimo and I were actually stuck for 5 days in this area because of heavy rains, and it was, of course, a great place to be stuck. That's where I met Massimo first, and we had a wonderful time together. So if you look at actually these sorts of examples, I can't go on and on with these examples, but there are thousands of places where people are protecting natural landscapes and wildlife species in either traditional ways or in new forms in different parts of the world. Then coming back to India, this is another example where these communities, where over 90 villages have made a federation of village assemblies where all the villagers are involved. And through that federation, they have taken back control over their forest, which was otherwise controlled by the government, but also stopped mining and then asserting their self-determination or self-rule. Interestingly, also, even as they struggle for equality in relation to the state or the government, within themselves, they know that they are unequal. And the women have been also asserting that they should have equal voice in decision-making in those communities. So trying to remove gender disparities also. A similar example, again, across the world, this is possibly the most well-known example of radical democracy or direct autonomy and self-determination in the world. The Zapatista, part of the indigenous peoples in that part of Mexico, in the Chiapas, have been practicing this for the last 3 or 4 decades of complete autonomy from the state and managing all their affairs, economic, political, social, cultural, through their own local communities, which are self-run. In the middle of all of this, in Central Western Asia, we have another inspiring example of people, a large ethnic community, the Kurdish, which is 40 million people, trying to assert peace within a very war-torn area. You know that this Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Quadri junction or the border areas have been areas of conflict for a long time. But here they're asserting their own ways of creating peace and also living with the earth through an ecofeminist principles called genealogy, or the science of women. So this is also an example of where they're trying to say that people and nature come first, not politicians and profits. Then up in Europe, I'm just trying to give a glimpse of various things in various parts of the planet. In Europe, these are a few examples that I've visited of people trying to create non-capitalist economic and living conditions through communes, through worker-run factories, through schools that are run partly with free community support of teaching and administration, of local currencies which are independent of the euro, and of communes where people are living as shared living spaces with most of the resources that are needed being shared rather than privately owned. So these and many, many others are also examples of where people are trying to resist and break out of a capitalist or state-dominated system. Back here in India, a city example, this is in Western India, a town called Bhuj, which is a very low rainfall area and a lot of poverty. And here in many of the neighborhoods, they have mobilized themselves to create their own housing, their own planning, their own energy and water needs, their own ways of waste management, but also forcing the city administration to support all of these activities and essentially say that even as urban residents, as residents of a city, we should be at the center of planning and budget making and so on. Why should only politicians and so-called experts be doing this? The more such examples of cities that are in transition in different parts of the world, many transition towns in Europe, starting from UK, food sovereignty, urban food sovereignty movements in South Africa, and a lot more. And this particular example in Copenhagen is also very interesting, where for the last 45 years or so, Christiania is a attempt at anarchic living, which is basically no state, no central governance, and all the businesses are run by cooperatives and no private property or private inheritance at all. Another sector which is very important for alternatives is learning and education, because this is really where all of us get our orientation to what we should do when we grow up, how we should behave towards other people and towards nature, etc. And we know that most schools in different parts of the world actually teach us what I would say the wrong values, that we have to be very competitive, we have to become rich and famous and powerful, and it doesn't matter what happens to other students. So these are examples of institutions trying to do things differently, where students have a lot of fun, there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of learning with fun, but also they learn responsibility towards other people. They learn to how to work in a community rather than as individuals, and to work with nature rather than exploiting it. I don't have the time to go into each of these examples, but there's material available on all of these on our websites, which you can look up. And as part of all of this work, one of the things I also do is to look at original meanings of words. And I found that the word school comes from the Greek word schole, which meant leisure or learning with leisure, which unfortunately is not what most schools are about across the world. One of the things we did in the last three years of the COVID pandemic was to look at where communities were able to cope with the crisis much better, or actually thrive through the crises, both in terms of health and also in terms of economic livelihoods, which otherwise collapsed in so many parts of the world. So these are about 100 examples from different parts of the globe, where we showed how the continuation of a community spirit, the access to collective resources for livelihoods and food, local self-reliance on things like energy and food and so on, actually managed to create the conditions for them to survive this sort of crisis. And this becomes very important, because the more we have things like climate collapse, the more communities will have to learn how to be resilient within their own resources. Okay, so building on these examples and stories, I'd like to now take the last section on what are the kinds of overall transformations that are emerging from these examples, and what can we think of in terms of a framework of transformation to look into the future. So something that's emerged from the South Asian examples is what we call the flower of transformations. We look at change taking place in 5 spheres of life: the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological. And of course, these are interconnected, intersecting in various different ways. So they're not independent spheres. And let me give you a sort of a quick glimpse of each one of these over the next few minutes. So the first one is politics. Now, we think of politics or of democracy as going to elections and voting what we think is the right party into power, and then hoping that it will do what we want it to do. And if it doesn't work, then we wait for the next elections, and then we try and vote another party into power. I know that Italy, for instance, has been going through this up and down for a long, long time, as has India. Whereas what these initiatives on the ground, these radical alternatives are asserting is that we might still go into elections and so on, but for us, the most important part is direct democracy, that we claim power where we are. For everything to do with whatever affects our life, we should be the ones taking decisions, not governments, not corporations, not bureaucrats, not politicians. And we make them accountable to what we need on the ground through this kind of very direct, decentralized decision making. And we can make them accountable with things like the right to recall representatives, public audits of everything they're doing, and a whole bunch of other things that people are experimenting on around the world, on how you can make representative institutions accountable to those institutions on the ground. The question that arises with this is that as you get into larger and larger scale, national and beyond national, global, how would this new politics look like? And we'll come back to that maybe in the discussion if you're interested. But there are many proposals for what could be replacing the United Nations, because the problem with the United Nations is that even though it's a very good forum for a lot of progressive things, it has limits because it is ruled by nation states, and nation states are intensely competitive with each other. So trying to go beyond those borders into what is called bioregionalism, which I'll talk about in a minute, we also then build a different kind of united peoples of the world, or world democratic confederalism, or other possibilities. Closely connected to that sphere of politics is economics. And here, what we are seeing from these examples is one, that people are arguing against economic globalization, especially financial globalization, to say, at least for basic needs like water and education and health and food and so on, we should be relatively self-reliant within our own region, our own territory. And that is eminently possible. But also, they're not saying that therefore we will close our communities off to people coming in from outside, like we don't want refugees and migrants, but to say, no, we welcome them, but within whatever the limits of this area are, and we welcome them into the same sort of system. They're also arguing that this sort of neat division between producers and consumers is wrong, that everybody can actually be a producer and a consumer. In fact, everybody is a consumer anyway, but we can all also be producers of various kinds. And we then build an economy where we're sharing our skills and our products and our services with each other. We also then work towards a world in which this very deep division between work and leisure is removed. That's a very Western thing. Here in the global South, we traditionally never had this thing of weekdays and weekends or work day and then vacation. It was all combined together. And how do we bring that back? Because if we actually love, if we are passionate about the work we do, then it's not like we're desperately waiting for a weekend in which to enjoy ourselves, right? We can do various things at various points in time. Then it is also about private property being challenged and recommoning at least nature, natural ecosystems, and knowledge, bringing all of that back into the commons, which is what it has been mostly traditionally. It is also about challenging the central control of banks and whoever controls centralized currencies like the euro or the dollar or the rupee here, and saying that, no, we need to actually have control over the economy through local relationships of caring and sharing, local exchange systems, alternative currencies, and so on. And if we put all of this together, then we're also arguing that GDP, that is rates of economic growth, which most countries use as a measure of development, has to be thrown out of the window. It actually is a pretty nonsensical indicator. It doesn't indicate anything meaningful, but that we bring in meaningful indicators, which are things like, does everybody have clean air to breathe? Does everybody have clean water to drink? Does everybody have good, nutritious, tasty food? Does everybody have learning opportunities? Does everybody have a voice in decision making? Is there gender justice? All of those things actually become indicators of well-being rather than this abstract notion of economic growth. Then there's the third sphere, which has to go hand in hand with these two, which is of social justice, because we know that all societies have traditional and new forms of inequality and deprivation. So the struggles for gender justice, the struggles for human rights, the struggles against casteism in India, against racism, the struggles that the so-called disabled people have to wage also to be equal to the so-called abled, all of this is also a very crucial element of transformation. The fourth sphere is that of cultural diversity, knowledge diversity, and commons. And here, there's a lot of decolonization that we have to do, a lot of unlearning, because through 500 years of colonization, we have all come to kind of think of what we mean by progress, what we mean by culture, what we mean by knowledge as being very monolith, very singular. Like knowledge, for instance, is only modern science and technology, which is not the case, right? We have many different kinds of knowledge systems. Similarly, culture is not just about speaking in English or Spanish or Italian. There are hundreds of languages around the world, all of which should be given equal respect. So this kind of decolonization also then means respecting all forms of faiths and ethnicities and religions, rather than trying to impose one on the other, which is happening in some parts of the world, including in India right now. Respecting languages, diversity, and then asserting public control over technology and media. By public, I don't mean government, I mean us, that we as citizens in democratic countries and societies need to have an oversight of what technological developments are okay, which ones are not. This is even more important these days in the context of increasing digitalization, artificial intelligence, and so on. And also with the media. Why should the media be controlled and captured by the biggest corporations on the planet. I love the map that I showed you earlier and which I reproduced here, because it actually is a very interesting conversation on how to decolonize even cartography, even mapping, because the normal map, which is supposed to be the right side up, is a colonial time map, which Europe is shown on top, and it's shown to be much larger than it actually is. These are the actual sizes of the continents that you see on this map. Finally, the fifth sphere of transformation is that of reinserting ourselves within nature as one of many, many, many species, all of which deserve equal respect. So this figure on the bottom left-hand side is what I grew up learning in biology, and I now realize that that's actually completely wrong, because it shows a hierarchy of living beings. It shows a man on top and a woman below and all other species below. Whereas the figure on the right-hand side is what indigenous peoples have believed for a long time, that we are a circle of life, all equal to each other. So how do we actually recognize that commonality of life as central, and of the spirit of not just human beings, but of all species? And this, in fact, is also happening in many parts of the world, where, including in the industrialized countries and societies, people are bringing or asserting the rights of nature, the rights of rivers, the rights of mountains, and trying to bring those into the legal or constitutional systems in many parts of the world. Now, putting all this together, one very interesting thing that emerges is, how do we look at political boundaries, today's political boundaries between nation states especially? And we realize that if you take South Asia as an example, that these political boundaries actually don't make any ecological or cultural sense. They are there because of various parts of history, including colonial history. But like the boundaries between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal and Tibet have broken up river systems into 3 or 4 parts, and each country does whatever it wants, like building a dam upstream, which creates serious problems for peoples downstream. So how do we reimagine boundaries, political boundaries, from the perspective of natural flows and also cultural flows? Nomadic populations that used to go between Ladakh in India and Tibet, which is now occupied by China, cannot do that anymore because there's a fence in between and armies on both sides. So nomadic populations, wildlife, ancient trading routes, how can we sort of reopen all of that by creating a relatively borderless South Asia, or look at that across the whole world? Right, now, these are the 5 spheres, but I think what's most important is the core of this flower of transformation, which is a set of principles, ethics, and values. And why this is important is because if we look at any of the examples of radical alternatives, at the base, the foundation of all of these is these principles. And that's what we can learn from them, not the exact techniques and technologies, but really these principles. I will not discuss each one of these. We don't have the time. But like I've been constantly saying, these examples of alternatives are about cooperation and not competition. They're about the commons, not about privatization. They're about ensuring that all kinds of labor, whether it's intellectual or physical, are equally meaningful, and that there should be dignity in whatever labor one is doing. They're about saying happiness is not just going shopping and shopping and shopping and shopping, but really about things like better social relationships, better avenues for learning, being out in nature, etc. So I'm not, as I said, I'm not discussing each one of these, but if we put all these together, I'm sure many of you can think of other such values. We're talking about visions, cosmovisions, worldviews that celebrate life. Unfortunately, in today's mad world, we celebrate money and fame and power. But what is fundamental to all of us is life. And if we do that, then we actually begin to really see the world in a very different way. Okay, I'll take just 5 minutes more. So what are the worldviews that celebrate life, which we already have, and how can we actually bring those more into the core of our lives? So in India, there's something called Swaraj, which means self-rule. Swaraj is self-rule. And the idea is, as I said earlier, that all of us are actually born with power for decision-making, and we should be asserting that. So we are all members of decision-making circles. But as we take decisions, We do that with responsibility towards other people and their well-being, and towards other species and their well-being. So therefore, we call it eco-swaraj, so self-rule within ecological core or radical ecological democracy. There are similar worldviews across the world. Some are very ancient, thousands of years old, from indigenous peoples in different parts of the planet. Some are newer, such as degrowth, ecofeminism, and so on, which have emerged from within industrialized societies. Some are reinterpretations of ancient religions, like with Christianity, we have the movement in South America for sort of reinterpreting it in the form of ecological responsibility and social responsibility from within Buddhism. The Dalai Lama has been speaking about this for a long time. And so in all religions, we're actually also seeing how people are trying to reinterpret them to go back to their spiritual foundations. Okay, nobody has all the answers. And I think there's a lot of issues that we need to continue dialoguing. We need to continue sort of discussing. We know that a lot of these ground level transformations are being led by communities in different forms, by civil societies. But many people still think that it's political parties like the so-called vanguard leftist revolutionary parties that will lead the way. Is that the case? Is it communities? Is it mass movements? Is it NGOs? Who will do it? It's a question. Do we still need a state, a government? If so, if not, what would replace it? If so, what would be its form and role different from what it is now? How would global governance look like, which I already talked about? What would the business sector look like? Who would run businesses? Would private sector have any role, or would it all be collectives, cooperatives, communities, producer groups? And how would studies change? How would universities change? How would you actually truly become transdisciplinary and not just in a superficial way? How would disciplines themselves, the boundaries between disciplines, actually disappear? Because when we live life, we don't live life with our economy separate from our politics, separate from our geography, etc. They're all combined. So how can we transform studies also, academics also in this way? And last but definitely not the least, we may have thousands and thousands of examples of alternatives, but how do they actually come together to achieve scale? And here, I think the question that a lot of people have asked me is, how do you replicate all these examples, or how do you upscale them? And my response has been that that's actually the wrong way of looking at it. Scale cannot be done in a meaningful manner through either replication, because every context is different, nor through upscaling, because then one initiative becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it begins to dominate others. But what I call outscaling, which means learning from these examples, trying them out in our own areas, doing whatever experiments we can, and then connecting horizontally with each other. So thousands of examples connecting horizontally across geographies, across cultures with each other, and creating scale through that kind of mass horizontal networking, creating webs, creating interconnections amongst these. So that is what I would think would be the way to try and achieve scale, and not upscaling or replication. So towards the end, I'll talk about two initiatives that we have started, which are trying to create this possibility of outscaling. One of them is in India, where about 95 organizations and networks which work across these different spheres that you can see on the screen, talking to each other, collaborating, doing joint actions, learning from each other, visioning what a better India could look like, and then doing policy advocacy for shifts in how governments work. We have physical confluences, we call them, in many parts of the country on different thematic areas, different regional topics. We've done about 30 of these so far. And we also have a website where there is documentation of successful alternative initiatives. About 2,000 stories of transformation on the ground are already on this website, and more keep getting added every week. Then, picking up on this example, we started connecting also to similar movements of alternatives in different parts of the world, and then trying to create this global tapestry, which is which started in 2019. And we have, I think, about 75 global or regional networks and movements as part of this global tapestry, with the same objectives as the Indian one, but at a global scale. This is just a short list of some of the groups that are involved. You'll see here feminist groups, conservation and environmental groups, youth groups, indigenous peoples groups, climate justice groups, all kinds of different organizations trying to come together at that global scale. And this is a website which also has stories from all over the world, like that Indian website. This one is more global. Every couple of weeks, the story gets added here of transformations in different parts of the world. So I'm going to end here just to point to two books. One that Massimo mentioned, Pluriverse, which is now available in 6 languages. The German one just got released, and there's been an Italian one already for the last year or so. It's French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And the book on the left is a very interesting experiment we tried. We asked 40 people who are working on different aspects of life, like gender and sexuality, education, health, farming and food, pastoralism, indigenous peoples, etc., to write about the India that they dreamed of in 2100, what it could look like, utopian vision, and then come back to now and say, okay, how do we get there? What are the pathways of getting to that kind of a future? And I am going to put my last slide up talking about utopias, because people often say utopias are useless. We're not going to get there. So Fernando Birri is an Argentinian filmmaker, and he was quoted by the famous Latin American poet Galeano as having said this, that utopia is on the horizon. I move 2 steps closer, it moves 2 steps away. I walk another 10 steps and utopia runs 10 steps further away. So as much as I walk, I never reach utopia. So then what's the point? The point is this: it makes us continuously advance towards the kind of future that we want. With that, I'll end. I'll share the presentation, and Massimo, you can share it with all the students also, to also look at these websites and get more information and analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish, for your contribution. Now we open the space for question. There is, if you want to make question first, if you want to present yourself firstly.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation.
Sorry, can I I'm just going to grab a paper and pen. Just give me a second.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, please go ahead.
No problem. My name is Fernanda. I'm from Nicaragua, a country in Latin America. So I would like to know your opinion, since you brought a list of issues to obtain this transformation in our world. So I would like to know what's your opinion on how to advance or move forward to a more decentralized point, especially in countries where governments are very rigid or actually stop this transformation to happen, and how to move forward to a more local government when we have this type of, for example, dictatorial governments or very rigid governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. So should I do question by question, or should should we wait for 2-3 questions? Massimo, how do you want to do it?
No, you can answer. We
Okay.
take one question.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Fernanda. So yeah, this is a difficult question. It's not obviously if you're in an authoritarian, you're in a state which is authoritarian, and the government is likely to crack down on any such initiatives. It is much more difficult than if you're in a relatively more democratic setup. But we know examples. In fact, the 2 examples I gave you, the larger scale ones of the Zapatista in Mexico and the Kurdish in the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey area, are both in situations of extreme authoritarianism, including the Mexican government. Mexican government claims to be democratic, but it actually has always been cracking down on the Zapatista kind of movements or others which are trying to assert indigenous people's self-determination. And yet they have sustained. The same with the Zapatista, with the Kurdish movement, where at least in some parts of the region, they're still sustaining, despite violent attacks by, for instance, the Turkish army. Now, according to them, the way to do it is to slowly build up people's power. It cannot happen overnight. People have to, first of all, gain the self-confidence that they can govern themselves. They have to gain the self-confidence that they can actually resist the state through sheer mobilization of people. They also have to be ready to face the consequences. So in all of these areas, people have been killed, people have been jailed, people have been charged with all kinds of criminal activities, falsely charged. But that's the price that has to be paid if one eventually wants, over a generation or 2 generations, to reach a stage where self-determination then becomes part of life, which is what's happened in these areas or some of the other examples that I gave. The second important thing is to build national and international solidarity. So because when you take these steps at that local level and the government or the corporations are cracking down on you, you need that solidarity. You need the expressions of support from the entire world to say, this is a legitimate exercise of people's rights. It is a legitimate exercise of demanding democratic rights, and we support it. That by itself may or may not stop the government, but it makes it a little bit more difficult for governments to actually take suppress that kind of a movement. Then each of these movements also has to build capacities across different sectors of life. You need to build legal capacity to fight in the courts. You need to build the local knowledge capacity to provide the evidence of why you're doing what you're doing. You need to build the capacity of, for instance, accounting, even mundane things like accounting and financial stability in your own society, etc. Yeah, so all of these are skills that also have, some of them may already exist in the community, some may have to be built over time.
Thanks.
So these are, and I realize that of course these are simple answers that I'm giving, but on the ground they are very difficult. But we know that it's possible.
Thanks, Ashish. There are a couple of questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Ashish, and thank you for your presentation. Mine is both of a comment and also a question. My first question, you mentioned something along the lines that I found really interesting to me, which was a quote you presented, like where in a developed country doesn't mean a country where the poor owns cars. It's a country where we have the rich using public transportation, for example. And and also later on, you mentioned about something related to education. And for example, giving an example from my own country, we have lost touch with our cultural values, for example, when it comes to the principles of ubumuntu, or where like we have a sense of community and sharing, where we are taught early on to strive for ownership and also privatizing. So growing up, you have this community which is more into being more individualistic and also owning. So my question is, based on your research and based on the people you've worked with, you just gave us a presentation where we have to have this holistic approach when addressing issues like climate change, and how there are many interconnected threads we have to address at the same time. education, sex and gender and everything in between. So my question is, what was like, with based on your research, people you have worked with, how did the communities revisited their ancestral ways of doing in order to bring up the sense of community and also living together? So what did they base on and how did they do it? Like some examples you may give us. Thank you so much again.
Thanks. Another question?
Sorry, could you also give your names and where you're from? It will just help me. So this previous speaker, where
Please present yourself.
My name is Sam and I am from Rwanda.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Maria Jose Huichay. I'm from Ecuador, and I have kind of a theoretical question. When I was in, I did my thesis, my bachelor thesis in a community, and they are against an hydroelectric project. And my research question was how they built resistance. But it was kind of funny because I want to know how they do that. Their agency, the participation, how they are organized and so on. But at the beginning, I realized that I don't know what is resistance. Because when I read about that, it was resistance is we can't have resistance if we don't have power. And we don't have power if we don't have resistance. So it's kind of a dialectical relationship. So as a group, we didn't know what is resistance for a concept. We construct that concept for us because in the literature, we couldn't find a concept to fit in our case. But since you have a lot of experience, I really want to know what is resistance for you and with your experience with that cases. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I think two good questions. The third good question. So the floor is yours now for the answer. And now we collect in the room other possible questions.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks, Sam and Maria Jose. So Sam, yes, actually for many of these movements, trying to revive, but not necessarily in exactly the same form that they were, traditions, cultures, values, languages, food traditions, rituals, spiritual traditions, and so on, is a very important part of the struggle. And there are many examples. So for instance, in the example I gave you where Massimo and I were there for 5 days with the Sapara indigenous nation in Ecuadorian Amazon, they have a school that they run themselves. And part of that is reviving a language, their own language, the Sapara language, which has otherwise almost completely died out because of colonial influence. And they know that reviving the language is not just about the words that are spoken, but also the knowledge that is built into that language. So they're saying, let these kids learn Spanish, of course, but they should also learn the Sapara language. So that's one. I was recently in Kenya. And in Kenya, in central Kenya, I went to 2 communities. There's a group called SALT that works with one of those communities, the Takara indigenous community, the Taraka, sorry. And the Taraka, what they're doing is to try and also revive pride in their own traditional ways of working with the earth, which involved a lot of prayer, a lot of rituals. It involved looking at the earth and seeds and other animals as being sacred, which was kind of dying out because of modernization. So they have reintroduced those in the schools and also in the society as a whole, as part of livelihoods generation, as part of their work on community-led ecotourism and other things that they're doing, so that it's kind of also connecting the revival of these ancient ways of living with also dealing with the modern world. So it's not disconnected. Otherwise, it becomes just a bookish kind of thing that, okay, I just want to revive it for the sake of reviving it. But they're trying to connect it to the struggles for livelihood security, the struggles for against imposition of destructive development from outside, etc. So these are 2 examples, and I can, of course, give many, many more. And I think that what's happening in all of these is, or many of them, is what I would call hybrid cultures. So, or hybrid technologies or hybrid ways of life, which is that they want to sustain some of what's there from the past, which they still think is important, and sustain or revive that. But also they're not saying completely no to modern ways of doing things. They're saying, okay, whatever is useful from there, insofar as it is in consonance with our community and our way of life and with nature, we will also accept that. So it's more sort of a hybrid cultures, hybrid languages, hybrid technologies that actually come out of this, which is very interesting. And I can, we can talk more about that, San, if you're interested from other parts of the world. Maria Jose, thanks for this. What is resistance? Well, let me give you what my perspective from here, from India now, because in India, we have had a very long tradition of resistance from hundreds of years back. We have indigenous peoples who, for instance, have fought against our Rajas, the kings. This is before the British came and colonized India. We used to have kings and rulers, princely states, as we call them. And whenever they used to impose their attempt, for instance, taking the forest away from the indigenous peoples or imposing their own systems, etc., then there would be people who would say, we don't accept that. We have our own way of life and we will not accept that. Now, that could be in the form of narratives, like why do we not accept it? Sort of giving, their own reasons for that. And or it could be in the form of physical resistance, like just blocking the road so that no government officer or no state or whatever can come in. This continued during the colonial times when the British came in. The first acts of resistance against the British colonial power was from central India, the indigenous peoples. And then there became a much larger independence movement in India, which finally achieved independence in 1947. Gandhi brought in his own ideas of what is resistance, what he called satyagraha, which means speaking truth to power. So saying we will never be violent. Against your violence, we will continue to be non-violent, but we will always speak what we think is right. And we will not accept, just because you're ruling us, we won't accept you. And you're saying if we think that it is not just. So resistance actually is a form of justice or seeking justice. It is about equalizing power relations. If somebody is dominating over you within a family, the husband dominating the wife, in a community, the village chief dominating everybody else, etc. Any form of unacceptable domination and inequalities of those kind. When you say that we want equalization of power, equalization of relationships, we want dignity in our lives, not the undignity that you are imposing on us. We want to be respected just like you want to be respected. All of this then forms what we could call resistance. And the physical act of blocking a road or whatever is really only one reflection or one form of resistance. But much more important is what is coming out as the narratives, as the arguments, as the perspectives from these movements or these people. So to me, of course, resistance and power are closely intertwined, but it's not the same thing. It is actually also deeply spiritual, cultural, ethical part of living, which is why satyagraha, meaning speaking truth to power. So it combines a whole bunch of different things. And it also then means that at least for, let's say, again, Gandhian traditions or many of the movements all over the world, that the means are as important as the ends. The end might be freedom, let's say, independence. Would you want to achieve that by killing off your enemies? Or would you want to achieve it through non-violent means? Or would you want to do a combination of some kind, whatever? So these are questions that arise as to how do you achieve your ends becomes as important. And to use ethics in the means as also in the ends is also very much part of resistance. I don't know, Maria Jose, if that kind of responds or not, but in a way, actually, the referendum that you just had on the Yasuni project is a form of resistance. I mean, it was mass mobilization across, from whatever little I understand from my friends in Ecuador, mass mobilization across the country to say that we don't accept oil drilling or mining in biologically diverse rainforest, which is also home to indigenous peoples. That movement won the referendum, and it was to me a fantastic act of resistance against corporate power or government power.
So, another question.
Hi, I'm Katerina. I'm from Greece. I'd like to ask you if you have any comment. I don't know if you followed the Beyond Growth conference in the European Parliament, and if you could comment on that. And also regarding the global tapestry of alternatives, when you say I know it's not, you've been working since 2019, but I was wondering what kind of policy and advocacy are you aspiring towards?
Sorry, there is another couple of questions. You? No?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Maya from El Salvador, and I was wondering two things. So you were mentioning these two initiatives, and I would like to know if the general long-term objective is to keep on functioning within the current structures and system that we have, which is like a capitalist system. And if it is, do you think it can be sustained in the long run because of the conditions that we have? And also the indicators that you were mentioning, like gender justice, is there a way to measure it so it can be demonstrated that there is gender justice? Or is it more a qualitative approach towards these indicators? Thank you.
We have another couple of questions.
Hi, my name is Maria Laura. I am from Bolivia. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was so inspiring. And actually, for me, the right to a sustainable city is something new that I would like to know, because also I'm a lawyer and I'm very interested about this. So how we can relate this right with another right as a collective, individual right? And also how could this be materialized, for example, in centralized cities or with centralized governments? Thank you.
Hello, I am Lorenzo from Italy, and my question is of a more economic nature, probably. So you mentioned clearly that there is a need to create a system, an economic system that goes beyond growth, hence beyond the GDP as a measure of economic performance, so to say. And I know there has been a variety of initiatives related to that, and also research. But then a thing I was wondering was, and I don't know if you have any example or maybe reading you could suggest me, was about the transition a society or a country or whatever would have to experience when abandoning GDP for another measure. Because then, from what I know, a big risk would be that kind of transition would imply a lot of instability in the sense of rising rates of unemployment, hence, a reduction of consumerism, which is great, but then probably a lot of instability again because of a vicious circle that will lead to further job losses, hence maybe reducing level of wealth and health within that context, abandoning GDP. So then I was wondering, essentially, if you knew any about any research that was studying this transition that would need to take place, which will be needed at some point, since we're living within a system that is physically and probably even socially not meant to last forever. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So Massimo, can I do these four? Because
yes, you can give it. Yes, you
Okay.
can give now to answer these 4 questions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting that all the people who've spoken so far have been from different countries. So you have a truly global class there, Massimo. Wonderful. So yeah, let me start with Katarina on the Beyond Growth conference. Maybe link that to also what Lorenzo was asking. I think the fact that a conference like that was organized at the European Union level is an indicator of at least some level of influence that the movements have had, the degrowth movements in this case, but also many other movements of well-being who are challenging GDP and challenging conventional economics. The conference itself, given that it was a very official forum, obviously could not be as radical as we might have wanted it to be. But I think it's a first step, and it's a positive sign of something moving somewhere, which could be that some people within some governments, some people within the European Commission, some people within Brussels or whatever, the European Parliament and so on, are seriously actually listening to these voices from the ground, the voices of the movements of resistance against, for instance, fracking in Germany, the movements on degrowth and so on, and the transition towns movement, etc. And also listening to some of the sort of intellectual, ideological outputs that have also come from within these movements. So positive in that sense, but a long, long way to go. Because the sign of whether, in fact, it's been truly influential is when governments themselves start moving away from economic growth and GDP as a means or a strategy towards development to looking at other indicators. And there, let me just quickly respond to Lorenzo. So I think what's happening is, if you look at, of course, Bhutan is the oldest example in the world of a non-GDP based development process. You may have looked at it, but it's called the gross national happiness. So they have, I think, about 30 indicators that they look at to evaluate every project on whether they should be okay with that project or not, which has nothing to do with economic growth rates or GDP. It's to do with, will it increase satisfaction levels? Will it increase happiness? Will it increase everybody's access to basic needs? Will it improve social relationships, etc.? Will it sustain the earth, the environment? So they're already showing us possibilities of a different way of measuring well-being, not development, but well-being. And now 5 other countries in the world, or regions of the world, I think New Zealand, Scotland, I think one of the Scandinavian countries, and basically 4 or 5 countries have formed a global alliance for well-being indicators, looking at how they would want to shift away from GDP to a bunch of sort of a mix of these well-being indicators. New Zealand, for instance, under the previous Prime Minister, already introduced mental well-being, mental health as a key indicator along with GDP in their development programs, and other countries are thinking of similar kinds of things. So in terms of the, just to answer second part of what Lorenzo was saying, in terms of the transitions towards these indicators, and here I think, Maya, you had a question about whether things like gender justice would be qualitative or quantitative. To my mind, this mix of indicators would be both. There are some things that you can quantify. You can, for instance, quantify, does everybody have access to clean drinking water? Okay, does 40% of the population not have clean drinking water? Does 30% of the population not have adequate nutritious food, right? So these are things that can be quantitatively measured. What you cannot quantitatively measure is things like gender justice. This is a matter of whether, for instance, the women from the family to society at large feel safe, feel respected, feel dignified, feel that they have an equal voice. You can't quantify that, but you can be asking these questions of people and then start getting a general sense of, yes, it is happening, or it's not happening, or it's only happening partially, etc. The same thing with satisfaction. Are people satisfied with their life? Are they happy? No, you can't quantify that. There is unfortunately there is something called the Global Happiness Index, according to which I think some Scandinavian countries are apparently the happiest countries in the world. And I think that's nonsense, really, because you just club a whole bunch of things together and you then put 9.5 and 8.6 and 2.28 or whatever, and it really doesn't make sense. So a lot of that has to be also qualitative. Do people feel empowered in their decision making, right? These are qualitative. So it'll have to be a mix of things, and that makes it more complicated. This is why governments don't want it, because it's so much simpler to have a central institution which just basically, puts standard things into everything, and then it's easy to say, yes, they're developed, we're not developed, or this part of the country is developed, that part of the country is underdeveloped, etc. But that's how it has to be. And the more we actually decentralize power and decision making, the more complex set of indicators can be possible to manage, because then you don't have one single institution in the country doing it. Now, will it lead to reduced, for instance, things like job loss and loss of well-being and so on? I think, Lorenzo, you're asking this question, reduced consumerism. No, because it really depends on what you're replacing, right? So supposing you are increasing GDP growth rates through higher industrialization, okay? And, let me give you the most nonsensical way of measuring GDP. If you get cancer, GDP actually increases because you're going to go to a doctor, you're going to pay the doctor, that's going to go into GDP calculations and GDP will go up. Half of society, half of the community having cancer, the GDP actually goes up. And that's absurd, right? What would you replace that with? You would replace that by saying, are communities healthy? Are people healthy? Is there enough health care in that system, right? Which can be both a quantitative and a qualitative measure. There is no need to lose health. You're actually becoming healthier. Or if you were to take consumption, yes, consumerism has to be reduced, significantly reduced, for us to reach the sustainability limits of the planet. But what do you replace that with? You replace it with, say, social relations. So instead of retail therapy, that is going shopping to remove my depression, I have other avenues to actually remove depression. Maybe, having a walk in nature or having a good 3-hour conversation with one of you and saying, oh, wow, this is what's happening in my life, this is what's happening in your life. No deadlines sitting on our heads, etc. I mean, there's many different ways of the different kinds of entertainment and so on. Why would that in any way lead to job loss? Now, if you're saying that, for instance, the workforce that is currently producing the goods that we are consuming would be out of jobs, the question then is, can one create alternative livelihoods that are not based on consumerism, but still meet people's needs? And this is eminently possible because there are still 1 billion, 2 billion people on Earth whose needs are not yet, basic needs are not yet being met. Most production is happening for meeting the wasteful luxury consumer demands. We produce 6 times more clothes than we need across the whole planet every year. Okay, so same thing with plastics or packaging or so many other things. So you replace that with actually what people need. You also replace that by saying that people may even need less money, so you don't need to work 6 days a week, morning, night, because part of your needs are being met through community systems. You don't need to pay high salaries for school. If the example I gave you of that school in Greece, if the school is run with high quality teaching but low fees because there's a community participation in its running and in teaching. So you actually begin, when you change this in many different ways, you realize that in fact, satisfactory livelihoods and jobs and living increases even as you reduce or do away with growth, economic growth. And there's a lot of literature on this. I can certainly send you many references. Okay, a couple of other questions. So back to Katerina, I've already responded to your Beyond Growth conference one. You also asked about what kind of advocacy plans for the global tapestry of alternatives. At the moment, we're doing 2 things. One, we're trying to create greater global strength and solidarity for the local movements. Because one thing we want to make sure is that as a global movement, we don't want to be up in the air. We want to be firmly rooted on the ground, which means in communities who are resisting and creating alternatives. That's our roots, that's our base, that's our foundation. Where they are resisting, the global tapestry will be with them and will create the possibilities of advocacy at the level of their national governments or at the level of the United Nations or wherever it's needed to stop the attack on them or to create policy shifts that would enable that. We are already doing that, for instance, with community conservation. We have a global network called ICCA Consortium, which for the last 15 years has been articulating and arguing and doing advocacy at the level of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and other United Nations and global forum to create policy shifts towards community-based conservation and away from the conventional model of protected areas, and quite successfully in some cases. So that would be what we would think of for advocacy with the global tapestry, supporting that, but then also creating more global forums for being at events like FAO or climate or wherever, where we can be doing actions and advocacy there. Maya, can alternatives work, or the kind of stuff I'm talking about actually work within a capitalist system? I would say no. I mean, we have to get rid of capitalism. But that's not the only struggle in town. We also have to get rid of statism, that is nation states dominating us. We of course have to get rid of patriarchy, racism, etc. Not everything is emanating from capitalism, which some people tend to think it is. Some things are much older, like casteism in India is much before capitalism. Patriarchy is much before capitalism, right? So, and here actually I would urge you to read some of the work of Abdullah Öcalan, which unfortunately is very little read across the world. He is the chief ideologue of the Kurdish movement. There's a lot of literature now available in English, and I think in maybe some in Spanish and Italian also, of his arguments about how the first colonization that ever took place was of the woman, of women, that is patriarchy, then of the nation states over people, and then capitalism. Nation states and capitalism coming kind of together. So that's really the different stages of colonialism. And now, of course, there's other forms like technology, digital technologies. And so for him, the struggles are against all of these. And so the radical alternatives we're talking about cannot work if any of these, they have to be able to challenge and undermine these systems and create systems of justice and equality and so on. And that doesn't necessarily only mean socialism also, because we know that state socialism, like in Soviet Russia, was equally problematic and oppressive. Okay, last couple of things. I think I responded to Katerina, Maya from El Salvador, and Lorenzo, Maya Laura from Bolivia. The right to a sustainable city, yeah. This is a relatively new concept. We know that struggles for the poor to have access to services in cities are a very, very long struggle for many decades. They've been there, or maybe centuries actually. The struggle for some level of ecological sensitivity in cities has also been there for a very long time. But these and others are kind of coming together in this movement of the right to a sustainable city, because it's not the right to the city, but the right to a sustainable city. And what these movements are arguing is that, like anybody else, like the rich, we as the poor have equal rights to everything that a city can provide us, services, etc., etc. But we will do that with responsibility towards other people and the earth. Exactly what I said about radical ecological democracy. And so some of the transition movements, transition town movements are like that. Some of the movements for dignified cities or safe cities or fear-free cities. In Europe, there's a movement for fear-free cities of enabling migrants and refugees to come and live with dignity. These are all part of what can be called the right to a sustainable city. Now, in this, the balance between collective rights and individual rights is, of course, a very tricky one. We know that we cannot go in that extreme direction of individualism that many modern capitalist societies have gone. But we also know that being only collective can also be oppressive for the individual. So how do you achieve that balance of having the individual space, but having the responsibility of collective living? Many of the recommoning exercises in European cities, for instance, are doing that. Instead of a car park, you convert it into an urban garden, and the whole community gets together to actually do gardening there. But everybody has their own individual plots, but they also share knowledge, they share produce with each other, and it becomes a kind of a community activity in which there's also that individual space. So we'll have to find those sorts of solutions to that issue. Can it happen within very centralized systems? It can, but it will be a struggle, it'll be a resistance, you're struggling against the tide. But that's the way to start it. And as I said earlier in response to the first question with, I think, Fernanda, this will happen if you're able to build national and global platforms of solidarity so that you can become much more strong, you can learn from others, and you can appeal for help if you're being attacked by the system.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ashish. I think the last question, because we should close soon this meeting.
Thank you, Professor. I really appreciated your presentation. My name is Beatriz. I'm from Brazil. And one discussion that we have in Brazil is regarding the administrative competence regarding environmental management. And in there, since we are a federalism, we have like the common competence between union states and municipalities. But sometimes states appropriate the municipalities' administration because of technical issues and financial boundaries. So I would like to know a little bit about your opinion about how could we help municipalities to develop and defend the local interests to administrate its own territory and environment. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think it's the last question for today because we should close this unit. Many thanks, Ashish. I let to you the answer.
Thank you, Beatrice. Happy to know yet another country in the room. So yeah, and again, no simple answers there. I think, let me give you an example of the one that I know of. This is in Ecuador. One of the counties there, which I had visited a few years back, was trying to take its own decisions with regard to agroecology, with regard to protecting the watersheds where the central government was proposing mining, and many, many other things. There were women mayors who were actually leading the struggle, trying to create the alternatives on the ground. And of course, they were constantly facing problems from the central government, even though it was one of those revolutionary leftist central governments. So what they were trying to do was to build solidarity with other communes and communities and cantons or municipalities who were also struggling, so that you could have, it wasn't just one single municipality, but a network of them. And also solidarity with movements in different parts of the world. So for instance, we also got involved in supporting their struggle against mining and for local agroecology, organic farming, and things like that. But it's not easy. After 2 or 3 terms where they were actually very successful in doing this, there was a setback, and they had to face some failures, but now they're trying to bring that back in. So it's a constant struggle. But really, that's how you would have to do it. You'd have to build these cross-geographic solidarities. You'd have to build your own competence to show that it's possible for the municipality to do self-governance. You'd have to show that maybe it's actually even in the constitution of the government. I don't know Brazil's constitution, but maybe it's in the constitution that municipalities do have that kind of power. And if not, then to fight for a new constitution, like what's happening in Chile, or happened, I think, also in Peru, where mass movement actually said, we don't believe in the existing constitution. We are going to build a new one, which has much more decentralized power, much more ecological sensitivity, much more rights of nature, and all of that. They're still struggling in Chile. They haven't yet been able to do it, but there's quite a mass movement on that. So I think those are the pathways of trying to do it and empower the municipalities. But I would just, one last thing I would say is that empowering municipalities itself may not be enough, because sometimes within the municipalities also you can have injustices, inequalities, unsustainabilities. Some municipalities may want to sell off all their forest and make their dams themselves and do mining to generate resources. So one would have to also think of, what are the narratives and the possibilities of municipalities also moving towards internal justice and sustainability in their own programs, even as they try and take control over their own lives. So not a fully satisfactory answer, I'm sure, because these are all very complex things. But just to actually say also, Massimo, and to all of you, my email is at the end of the presentation. If anybody wants to continue this dialogue, please feel free to write to me, send me an email. I also, through our global tapestry, we also have connections in many parts of the world of people doing all these things, and I'm happy to put you in touch with those movements in different parts of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish, to be here with us, to share your experience and your time. Thanks, and see you soon, and good work for your activity.
Thank you. Namaste.
Ciao.
Ciao.